Hello, and welcome to the Europe at War podcast.
Episode 3.8, the 26th of April. As the sun rose on the morning of the 26th of April, the remaining German troops defending the centre of Berlin were going through hell. Russian shells rained down on them day and night. Supplies and ammunition were dwindling, and wherever they looked, a seemingly endless horde of Soviet tanks and infantry were marauding through the city. Orders from the German military leadership were struggling to reach the frontline troops, and even when those orders did arrive, they were often completely out of date, as the rapid Soviet advances were changing the nature of the battlefield on an hourly basis. In short, the chances of the Berlin garrison holding out for long looked slim. In a desperate effort to bring in more supplies for the garrison troops, and in light of the attacks which were being launched on the Gatow and Tempelhof airfields, the German defenders were forced to build a makeshift airstrip in the Tiergarten park between the Siegersäule and the Brandenburg Gate. And at dawn on the 26th of April, the airstrip saw its first action when a squadron of Me-109s battled through the wall of Soviet flak in order to drop more than 100 ammunition crates onto the airstrip. Despite the guts the pilots showed in flying through the maelstrom of anti-aircraft fire, the squadron suffered terrible losses, and to make things worse, barely 1/5 of the supplies could actually be recovered by the German ground troops. This was because Soviet artillery fire zeroed in on the airstrip, decimating the troops trying to reach the crates, or blowing apart the crates before they could be recovered. Given that such a minuscule amount of crates were successfully retrieved, it was decided not to drop any future supplies from the air, but to instead have future Luftwaffe supply planes land at the airstrip instead. After the debacle of the first supply drop, the craters caused by the shelling were hurriedly filled in, and at 10:30 a further supply run was attempted. This time, 2 Junker 52s managed to land safely with their cargo of ammunition intact. And half an hour later, the planes took off again, ferrying away seriously wounded soldiers and civilians. However, one of the planes hit an obstacle on takeoff and crashed, killing everyone on board. After this second fiasco, the Germans realized that the airstrip was simply too dangerous to use, so they abandoned any future resupply missions using the airstrip. But whilst the Berlin garrison was on its last legs, the people of Berlin were also living in a waking nightmare. By now, fires were raging throughout the centre of Berlin, unchecked, as the city's firemen were unable to put them out due to the constant Russian shelling. And due to the lack of water and the complete breakdown in the plumbing network, the people were unable to wash, meaning that their clothes were filthy and their bodies were caked in ash, blood, and sweat. The people didn't care, of course, as all they really cared about was surviving. Due to the ruptured sewage mains, Berliners had to boil contaminated water first before drinking it, and the Berliners also made sure to store the boiled water in jars to keep them going through the days of fighting ahead. By this point in the fighting, organised healthcare was virtually non-existent. Most of the hospitals had been evacuated, and the ones which were left were unable to cope with the torrent of wounded soldiers and civilians who came through their doors. Soviet shelling was launched at random intervals, and hospitals weren't spared from the barrages. No warning was given, of course, about the shelling, meaning that the doctors and nurses were unable to move the most severely wounded down into the safety of the cellars in time. Surgeries were conducted in the basements of the hospitals, and these surgeries had an almost medieval feel to them. many were performed without proper antiseptic or anesthesia, and the surgical instruments were placed in boiling water as a crude attempt at sterilization. Alcohol was also used as a disinfectant, and if there was any drink left over, then the lucky patient was given some to help numb their agony. And if that wasn't enough, because the hospitals were often without power, surgeries had to be performed under emergency lighting, with one hospital even requiring someone to frantically pedal on 2 bicycles fitted with dynamo headlights in order to provide the lighting for each surgery. But whilst Berliners suffered, the battle raged on. The Soviets began their operations on the 26th of April with another massive air raid as part of their continuing Operation Salute. And on the 26th, the city centre of Berlin was pummeled by 563 heavy bombers. Whilst the Red Army Air Force was pounding the centre of the city, to the northwest of Berlin, the 79th Rifle Corps from the 3rd Shock Army attempted once again to cross the Westhafen Canal into Moabit. When the whistles blew and the attack began, a battalion of riflemen was sent in to attempt a crossing over the half-destroyed Königsdamm Bridge. And as they stumbled and clambered over the destroyed remains of the bridge, the German defenders on the southern bank of the canal poured defensive fire into their ranks. A few men from the Russian battalion did manage to reach the southern bank of the canal, but they were quickly wiped out in an immediate German counterattack. The Soviets then launched a second assault over the bridge, this time using a company of chemical warfare specialists rather than normal infantry. And this company was able to get enough men and equipment across in order to establish a small bridgehead on the southern side of the canal. The company then immediately laid down a huge smoke screen, masking the arrival of more troops who, once across, helped fortify the bridgehead on the southern bank. As soon as the bridgehead was secured, further waves of reinforcements were flung across the canal to expand the bridgehead, and even supporting artillery pieces were successfully transported over the wrecked bridge. Incredibly, these guns had to be pulled over the bridge by hand, as all of the horses drawing the guns had been killed in the fighting. The Soviets quickly capitalized on their success, and as reinforcements poured across the canal, they were able to bypass the German defenders at the Beuselstrasse and Westhafen S-Bahn stations. And by nightfall, the Soviet 79th Rifle Corps had advanced deep into Moabit. In the process, the Soviets managed to capture 100 enemy troops, and they also stumbled across a group of 1,200 Russian prisoners being held at a prison in the district. Freedom for the Russian prisoners was a bittersweet moment, however, because as soon as they were liberated, they were promptly fed, rearmed, and sent back into the front line. This might sound harsh, but the assault on Berlin was costing the Red Army thousands of men a day, so they couldn't be too picky as to where they got replacements from for their frontline units. To the east of the city centre, the 7th Rifle Corps, also from the 3rd Shock Army, had by now reached the perimeter of Alexanderplatz, but it was struggling to advance further into the centre of Berlin due to the intensity of the German defensive fire. In response, the Soviet riflemen started circumventing the German defences, and they tried sneaking into the centre of the city by going through the S-Bahn tunnels, just as the Berlin garrison had feared. Meanwhile, in South Berlin, the Soviet 4th Guards Rifle Corps from General Chukov's 8th Guards Army launched further assaults on the pockets of Neukölln still in German hands. And despite the desperate efforts of the Nordland Panzergrenadier Division and the French SS Charlemagne tank hunters, the Berlin garrison forces were finally dislodged from their positions around Hermannplatz. By now, the Karstadt department store on Hermannplatz was on fire, and the store's 2 rooftop towers, which had dominated the skyline of Neukölln, were gone. A Frenchman with the SS Charlemagne contingent described the day's fighting in Neukölln. Our men advanced as if on exercise, jumping from doorway to doorway, over walls and rubble, and they fell on the Russian infantry, who were spread out on the various floors. The following tanks spurted fire and flames, hardly giving the Russian infantry a chance to fire back. Our attack made progress, and it was then that we received a blow. A reserve section coming from Neukölln Town Hall and thinking themselves safe were still in marching order when suddenly a series of Russian tank shells fell on the street corner. Broken-hearted, I counted about 15 bodies of young soldiers lying in the roadway, which was running with blood. There was no longer any front line, either alongside us or behind us. What shall I do? I asked myself. Surely we should not hold on here. In the meantime, let us make sure that we have not been surrounded. Meanwhile, the fighting at Tempelhof airport continued throughout the morning of the 26th, with the Panzer Division Müncheberg launching counterattacks from the hangar buildings towards the Soviet forces who occupied the runways and airfield. However, with each frantic counterattack, the Müncheberg division was losing more and more tanks. Soon, they were reduced to launching solitary tank attacks supported by ragged bands of infantry and Hitler Youth boys armed with Panzerfausts. These makeshift combat teams, totaling no more than a few dozen men and boys at most, were attempting to face off against entire Red Army units composed of dozens of tanks and thousands of men. The Germans didn't stand a chance. Given the huge disparity in numbers, the Germans inevitably couldn't maintain their defense of Tempelhof. And as the advance of the Soviet flanking attacks through Schöneberg and Neukölln threatened to cut off the remaining German troops at Tempelhof, the Germans were left with no other option but to retreat from the airport in the afternoon. The remaining German units pulled back to the Anhalter Bahnhof in the centre of Berlin, with the last 8 Tiger tanks which survived the fighting at Tempelhof ordered to pull back to the Tiergarten to bolster the defence line around the Reichstag. Fresh from their capture of Tempelhof, General Zhukov's forces drove on northwards and occupied Victoria Park. The park then granted them an elevated position upon which they could install heavy 205mm guns to rain fire down upon the German forces at the Anhalter Bahnhof. The Soviet forces continued their thrust into the Tempelhof and Schöneberg districts, and by the evening of the 26th of April, the 8th Guards Army and the 1st Guards Tank Army had reached Potsdamer Straße, whilst some elements had even penetrated further and were fighting German forces close to the Nollendorfplatz U-Bahnhof. The fact that 1st Belarusian Front forces were now present in these areas made a mockery of the demarcation line Stalin had drawn up on the 23rd of April, which had clearly assigned these areas of Berlin to the remit of Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front. A charitable interpretation of this would be that the new demarcation line had possibly not been communicated to General Zhukov and the other senior 1st Belarusian Front commanders on the ground. A more likely explanation is that General Zhukov probably knew damn well where the demarcation line was. He just simply chose to ignore the line as he wanted to move his troops into the best position possible for his upcoming attack across the central section of the Landwehr Canal leading into the centre of Berlin. In any case, the outcome was that 1st Belarusian Front forces were now present within the designated operating area of the 3rd Guards Tank Army, which belonged to the 1st Ukrainian Front. And to make things worse, the 3rd Guards Tank Army didn't even know that the 1st Belarusian Front forces were there. This lack of coordination led to a sharp increase in the number of friendly fire incidents, as the two fronts were indiscriminately launching huge artillery and Katyusha barrages at the remaining German forces in the area. These awesome displays of firepower inflicted almost as much damage on the respective Soviet fronts as they did on the remaining Berlin garrison troops, with shells fired at German positions often overhitting their targets and slamming into Soviet positions instead. Moreover, various air armies were attached to each Red Army front, and thus when they launched bombing raids in support of their respective ground forces, they often hit Soviet infantry from the other front by mistake. As we've spoken about before, this lack of coordination between the two fronts was reflective of the personal rivalry between Marshal Zhukov and Konev. But this rivalry between the two men was starting to infect the behavior of officers further down the chain of command. This led to instances of pure pettiness, such as when General Chukov of the 8th Guards Army ordered that burnt-out German and Soviet tanks should be placed as barricades in streets, in order to prevent 1st Ukrainian Front tanks from advancing towards the Reichstag. Despite the unnecessary deaths caused by the inter-front rivalry, Marshal Konev's forces ploughed on with their own advance towards the centre of Berlin, with elements from the 3rd Guards Tank Army reaching the inner defence ring of the S-Bahn line between Friedenau and Schmargendorf. Meanwhile, further west, the 55th Guards Tank Brigade, also from the 3rd Guards Tank Army, entered Charlottenburg after striking through the Grunewald forest. As the tank brigade proceeded down Heerstrasse and past the Olympiastadion, the ragtag elements of Volkssturm defenders, armed with First World War-era rifles and a handful of grenades, were no match for the advancing columns of Soviet tanks, machine gun-wielding infantry, engineers, shock troops, and artillery. This tank brigade continued their advance, and by nightfall they had reached the Eichkamp residential complex, putting them a stone's throw away from what is today the grounds of the Berlin Messe Exhibition Centre, which, in April 1945, represented the western edge of the inner defence ring. And once they reached this point, the Soviets paused, and they sent out scouts to assess the strength of the German positions ahead of them. Despite these successes within Berlin, Konev's forces were nevertheless having to juggle the assault on the capital, whilst fending off the increasingly effective counterattacks on their western flank by General Wenck's 12th Army. Moreover, General Busser's 9th Army had also started launching the first of its breakout attempts from the Halbe pocket. Konev's forces were thus being pulled in 3 different directions, and given these difficulties, it's amazing that the 1st Ukrainian Front was able to maintain its advance into Berlin at all. Still, despite the friendly fire incidents between Konev's and Zhukov's forces, and regardless of the movements of Wenck and Busser's armies outside of the city, the overall Soviet assault was going to plan, and the Germans were being pushed back further and further towards the heart of Berlin. The pointless nature of the German defence was summed up by the pathetic slogan of "Berlin stays German," which was painted by Goebbels' propaganda officials on walls across the city. To ram home the fact that this slogan was just wishful thinking, on one wall a Russian soldier had added their own words underneath the slogan, boasting that "I'm already here in Berlin," Signed, Sidorov. In a further sign of the desperate state Berlin was in, during the course of the 26th of April, the city's last telephone links with the outside world were finally severed. Now, the only source of information available to the Berlin garrison forces and civilians stuck within the city was the highly unreliable Panzerbeer newspaper, which was a 4-page glorified pamphlet produced by Goebbels' propaganda ministry. The Panzerbeer was the epitome of fake news, as it routinely boasted of phantom German victories on the battlefield, even going so far as to claim that towns such as Oranienburg had been recaptured by counter-attacking German forces. Furthermore, the Panzerbeer peddled the lie that General Wenck's 12th Army would soon reach the city and free the trapped people of Berlin. In reality, by this stage in the battle, it was clear the Germans were going to lose Berlin. So in a desperate attempt to save the lives of his remaining garrison troops, General Weidling started formulating an escape plan for his forces. That evening, Weidling travelled to the Führerbunker, and he presented his breakout plan to Hitler. Essentially, Weidling's plan was for the Berlin garrison, acting as Hitler's escort, to break out westwards and link up with the remaining German forces outside of the city. This breakout was to be led by an armoured spearhead consisting of all of the tanks which could still fight, supported by the remaining combat troops under Weidling's command. Following this vanguard would be the Führergruppe, consisting of Hitler himself, joined by his personal staff, and the rest of the senior Nazi and military leadership. And then, in order to give the breakout group a chance to escape, a single division of troops were to act as the rear guard, doing their best to hold off the Red Army. Weidling pleaded with Hitler that he permit this breakout attempt to be launched on the 28th of April, arguing that the Berlin garrison could only hold out until then anyway. Weidling tried using every moral, tactical, and logical argument he could think of to persuade Hitler. But the Führer simply shook his head and replied, "Your proposal is perfectly all right. But what is the point of it all? I have no intention of wandering around in the woods. I am staying here, and I will fall at the head of my troops. You, for your part, will carry on with the defense." Weidling's plan had presented the best chance that at least some of the garrison troops could make it out of Berlin alive. But Hitler's refusal to think of anyone other than himself condemned the trapped garrison troops to captivity or death at the hands of the Red Army. This wasn't the most depressing and farcical episode from the Führerbunker that day, though, as the issue of who would replace the disgraced Göring as head of the Luftwaffe was finally solved, in ludicrous circumstances, of course. So a few days previous, on the 23rd of April, Göring had been stripped of all titles and responsibilities following his failed coup against Hitler. And as a result, Hitler had decided to appoint Colonel General Robert Ritter von Greim as Göring's successor. Hitler insisted on making this appointment in person. Therefore, poor old von Greim was forced to leave the relative safety of Munich and embark on a hair-raising trip to Berlin. Luckily for von Greim, however, Hitler's favourite test pilot, Hannah Reitsch, who also happened to be von Greim's mistress, volunteered to fly with him to the capital as his co-pilot. And as it turned out, he certainly needed a co-pilot of her caliber, because as von Greim's aircraft passed over the Grunewald forest on its final approach towards the Reichstag, Soviet anti-aircraft fire raked the plane, seriously wounding him in the leg. Hannah Reich immediately took action and leaned forward over von Grime's shoulder to land the plane safely on the makeshift airstrip in the Tiergarten. Her quick thinking had saved them both from certain death, and as a result, von Grime managed to reach the Führerbunker in one piece, although he was carried unceremoniously through the front door on a stretcher. As planned, soon after arriving, Hitler promoted von Grime to Field Marshal and appointed him as Göring's successor as head of the Luftwaffe. And that was that. The man had made a death-defying journey and flown through the war-zone skies of Berlin just to receive a promotion which could have been given to him over the phone. Not to mention the fact that given the Luftwaffe had basically ceased to exist by now, the decision by Hitler to personally promote von Grime to the head of an utterly toothless organization was a pointless exercise anyway. Once the ceremony was over, Hitler wanted von Grime to leave immediately and take up his new duties. But von Grime's injuries prevented him from leaving. In the Führerbunker, the madness never ends.